Hi, everybody. Welcome to Growing Up in Science. People are still coming in, but we can get started. Growing Up in Science, some of you might be joining for the first time, is a series in which we try to highlight the human stories behind the scientists and behind the science. And speakers often talk about their circuitous or detour field path towards where they are now. Everybody's story is unique. We have heard many stories over the years, and often they have interesting parts that you would never hear in a scientific talk. And in addition to that, Growing Up in Science organizes themed events about issues that affect trainees in academic science, such as the quality of mentorship, also anti-racism, which is a big topic in our community, of course, nowadays, and transitioning to jobs outside of academia, topics like those. So today we're really thrilled to have as our guest Daniel Colón-Ramos from Yale, who is going to tell his life story, and it will actually intersect with some of those broader themes. Camille will probably say a little bit more, but my job is to introduce Camille, our moderator. She is a third-year PhD student in neuroscience at New York University, working in computational neuroscience. She's from San Juan, Puerto Rico. She actually interned in Ciencia Puerto Rico, which is the nonprofit organization that Daniel founded. And she is also the managing editor for the magazine Science for the People, which I would encourage you to check out. With that, I'm going to leave it to Camille, or maybe before that, quick logistics. You can type your questions and comments in the Q&A. If you want, you can change your name for anonymity. Then you can upvote and comment questions by others. And if you want to have general discussions or not questions to the panel, then please use the chat. Thank you and have fun.
Thank you, AG. I'll be speaking today with Dr. Daniel Colón-Ramos, who is a professor of neuroscience and biology at Yale University, where his lab uses C. elegans as a model organism to study synapse formation during development and learning. And he is also the founder of the organization Ciencia Puerto Rico, which is a collaborative network for people interested in science in Puerto Rico, and that does a lot of work to advance science education on the island. Daniel, would you like to take it away? Can you start telling us about your childhood and maybe any experiences that were particularly influential in your intellectual development?
Yes, well, thank you, Camille, and thank you, AG. This is an amazing initiative. I didn't know about it until I was invited, and I spent several hours listening to the talks. I sent it to all my students and posted it in social media. It's eye-opening and inspiring to see, kind of, to bring the humanity into the sciences. Like when you first invited me, I was thinking, well, you know, my story is pretty mundane. Like, what can I have to share that people want to hear about? But
absolutely not. Absolutely not.
I also worried about telling chronological stories for two reasons. One of them is that obviously they're filtered by my memories of them. So they're, like all narratives, they're incomplete. But I also felt that when I listened to those stories as a student, they sounded like roadmaps, and I pay attention to them like roadmaps. I was trying to like draw lessons from them or strategies. And I wanted to share mine today by first stating that it is not a roadmap. It is one way in which it happened for me. There are many paths to being an academic professor, which is what I do today. The person downstairs from me, Mike Nitabak, had a far more interesting story. He after he's finished his graduate school, he decided that science wasn't for him. He went to law school. As he was studying for his boards for law school, he actually decided to help a friend of his start his lab, and now he's a professor here. Mark Hammerlund, who's one of my best friends here at Yale, did almost everything on the book that you're not supposed to do when you are developing a career towards research. He stayed in the same lab that he went for his grad school. He stayed as a postdoc. His undergrad was in English. He actually became interested in science after he had worked in the White House under the Clinton administration. He was rock climbing, and in a camp, he listened to somebody talking about science, and he said, that's cool. And then he kind of joined a lab as a technician, and now he's a professor at Yale. There are many routes to this. Mine is pretty traditional, and I'll be sharing it today, but I don't want to in any way make it sound like it's the only one. And the last thing I'll say is I've had a pretty rosy experience within the system. So I haven't even been a survivor. I have actually been successful in the system. So I want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that is part of my story too. So I was born and raised in Puerto Rico into a middle, lower class family. My parents were the first generation of my both sides of the family to go to college. They were fortunate enough to go to college in the University of Puerto Rico system, which is the public system there. Before that, my grandparents didn't finish middle school. Like actually my dad taught his mother to read. So in the 3 generations leading to mine, we lived in very different Puerto Ricos. Like my grandparents were like from a really rural part of Puerto Rico called Barranquitas, which is a small town in the middle of the island. That's where my parents grew up, kind of washing clothes in the river and, without power for most of their lives and things like that. As Puerto Rico was becoming industrialized towards the rural areas, then they went to study in the metropolitan area. My dad studied to become a priest. So the same way that their families here in the US they use the military to kind of like pull out of poverty. For my dad, it was the Catholic Church that he used as a way to come out of poverty, but it took him to study in Europe. Like he went to Italy to become as a seminarista, as a person that's studying to become a priest. And then eventually he left that track, obviously, and then met my mom and started a family. But my family, because of my dad's trajectory and my mom's values, was very focused on education. So they were lower to middle class, but all of the resources went to their kids. They still do, like all their time is kind of dedicated to us. And in retrospect, now that I have kids, I realize how much they actually invested in us. It was a pretty structured household. Like my dad was kind of like, because he had gone to Europe and then come back to Puerto Rico, he kind of wanted to imitate what he had seen in Europe and make sure that he helped navigate his kids through the education system in Puerto Rico, which he himself had not been able to successfully navigate completely. So he was pretty strict with us. And it was a conservative household, I will say, because, we would go to church every Sunday. Like it was that kind of household. I went to Catholic schools growing up, and that was my background. It was kind of a hybrid experience of growing up in kind of not exactly poor, but resource limited in Puerto Rico. But at the same time, because my parents invested so much in the education, I was able to go to some of the best schools in Puerto Rico because of scholarships and be exposed to people that had very different lives from me, that are some of my friends now, but I was between this privileged environment and kind of like my family environment, which was more, not as privileged, but privileged in other ways, privileged in the sense that my parents invested so much in me. When I was in school, in elementary school, I was the kind of kid that asked a ton of questions. Annoyingly so, like I annoyed everyone. I think it was because my parents didn't, they will entertain any question that I will have. Like, it didn't matter what, like my wife actually pointed it out to me after we got married. She said, you know why you ask so many questions is your parents always entertain your questions. They never told you to stop asking questions. And it's true. Like in retrospect, I think that's probably what motivated all the questions. But by the time I graduated from 6th grade, my moniker, everyone had like a little thing I was like the student with 1,000 questions, and it wasn't meant to be flattering. It was like people graduate. And I asked a lot of questions, but I also didn't do that well in school. Like in elementary school, I wasn't an outstanding student. My sister was. I have a sister who's brilliant. She's a faculty member studying nutrition at George Washington University with Joan Colón, and we're like 1 year apart. So we're like really good friends, a little competitive with each other, particularly at that stage. And I remember clearly sitting in a parent-teacher meeting where one of the teachers was telling my mom, you know, Danielle could do as well as Uri Joan. And I remember feeling so proud about that possibility. Like I was like, really, I can? So I wasn't doing that well. She was doing great. And one of the reasons was because in retrospect, I didn't feel that the science that was being taught was contextualized for me. Like it wasn't, I'll give you a concrete example. Like I remember this like it was yesterday. I remember having to memorize like examples of like seed dispersal is one of the things that I remember still. And the examples of seed dispersal that were taught in Puerto Rico, they used books that were translated and came from the Northeast mostly. And the examples of seed dispersals that were used were examples like the maple tree, which is a beautiful example. You know, they form the helicopter-shaped seeds and you see them everywhere in New England. The first time in my life that I saw a maple tree seed was when I was in college. There are no maple trees in the Caribbean. There are no in the tropics. There are none. So, but they're beautiful examples of seed dispersal in the tropics. It's a tropical rainforest. They're like these transparent, membranous seeds that are heart-shaped, gorgeous. It looks like a work of art that all the Puerto Rican kids that have grown up there will recognize them as a sign of summer vacation, because you see them everywhere. People chase them. They come out of these seapods that look like canoes that kids put in the rivers and follow them around. But that wasn't the example that we were taught. All the examples that we were taught came from books that were translated mostly from the US or Europe and had nothing to do with Puerto Rico. Another example that I remember vividly was when I was studying, physics in elementary school. They had these pictures of mostly white kids with balloons rubbing their hair and their hair standing up. And I don't know if you've been to Puerto Rico or the tropics, but if you're there, you don't need a balloon for your hair to stand up. It's 90% humidity. Your hair is like this all the time. And so I remember trying, I was like, my hair is not changing. So those lessons to me, what they communicated as a Puerto Rican kid interested in science, because I was very curious as a kid. They communicated science is cool, but it has absolutely nothing to do with you. Like it's not something that's relevant to Puerto Rico or your people or you. And moreover, like I remember my dad, and this actually made an impression that I'll talk about it later, because that it led to me now later as I became a scientist, founding a nonprofit to tackle some of these problems, because I realized this wasn't a situation unique to me. But I remember my dad will cut out the science part of the newspaper and save it for me, and he will only give it to me after I finish my homework. And I was always very excited to read it. But the science section of the newspaper were always articles that were translated from either Canada or the US, written mostly by Isaac Asimov or Carl Sagan, which is cool. And I think it's great to have examples of science from elsewhere. But day after day of reading articles about the space from Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov communicated to me as a Puerto Rican kid that there was no science going on in Puerto Rico, or no science that was totally relevant to Puerto Rico.
What was there anything, when was the first moment that you realized, maybe during childhood, maybe later on, that science was relevant for you as a Puerto Rican?
I think it took until like grad school for me to kind of put the two parts together. What I did realize that it wasn't as clearly stated as the thought that you just verbalized was that I had a lot of questions that I felt that I couldn't get the answers to. That's what I kept on asking questions.
Yeah.
And on one hand, you have like, these examples that I'm bringing, but on the other hand, like I use this in my talks now, you will go to the ocean and you will see leatherback turtles hatching from the nest, kind of beelining it towards the ocean. I will go to the creeks that near my hometown in Barranquitas, and you will see ghost shrimp, and you can see all sorts of fascinating behavior and nocturnal filter shrimps that we call guavaras that come out and are, I will go fishing with my cousins and see like how you shine a light and they don't move. And, unless you had your eyes, for me, like, unless I had my eyes closed, I will always be having a question about how does this work and how come no one is looking at this?
Yeah.
And how come this is understood for other parts of the world, and it's not understood for here or even contextualized for here? Or does this have to do with what other people are talking about in other places? Like, you know, this thing about evolution, does this have to do with what's going on in this creek? Like, I just had questions like that. So in a sense, I was grappling with that aspect of how science had to do with Puerto Rico, but I couldn't verbalize it. It was just kind of like a tension between feeling excluded from the scientific enterprise and being really interested in science.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think for me, when I realized that science was, or that Puerto Rico had a lot to contribute to science, was when I read in a textbook about the bioluminescent bays and how rare they are and how we have like 3 of them. And so then I realized, like, wow, this is actually a very interesting environment. I have a lot of questions that I can answer that relate to my home through science. And
Right.
On sort of this topic, I wanted to ask, you're a very socially engaged person. What are the experiences or who are the people in your early stages of life who led you to have such a commitment to Puerto Rico? Or to the community at large, you know?
Yes, I think to a large extent my parents, just by entertaining my questions. Like, also one thing that I had to grapple with later as a scientist, besides my identity and science and all these topics that we're talking about, was my commitment to just social justice. Like, I was listening to Wage's talk about him growing up in the Netherlands, and it resonated with me in a way. When you get, like we were talking earlier before this talk, when you get really specific about your experiences, you start finding common denominators in what seemed to be the most kind of like arbitrary and whimsical experiences turn out to be really foundational common denominators. In my case, that came because my mom was an occupational therapist, and they couldn't afford, you know, we didn't have like a nanny or like an after school or things like that. So I would just go with her to work, and she would be working with kids that were like autistic or had Down syndrome or different neurodevelopmental disorders, helping them with their motor skills. And I grew up with those kids. Like, since I was really young, I felt very comfortable around kids with mental disabilities. And I also, because of those experiences early on, I saw my mom working with them. And I don't even want to use the word helping them. It was more like a working with them. So I saw what those kids, like, I just had a different perspective about how people with mental disabilities should be treated since early on. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't because of my parents. And then, so I had, on one hand, my dad, who was like he's really an intellectual, and he was really pushing education. My mom, and my dad also, like, they were, when the AIDS epidemic came to Puerto Rico, they volunteered and they were working with all these patients that suffer of AIDS. So it was a conservative household from like kind of like a Catholic moral standpoint, but a very socially progressive household in terms of like social justice and things like that. And that was the environment that I grew up in, and that inspired me to continue. I didn't know any scientist. So I remember when I started verbalizing that I wanted to become a scientist, like, people, I think the careers in Puerto Rico around maybe high school for me, middle school, high school. And people were like, well, you mean a doctor, like an MD? You want to be an MD? And I was like, no, I want to be a scientist. And they're like, what are you going to do? And I'm like, I'm not sure. So, I didn't know any scientists. I'm like, I don't know. I just like asking questions. I don't see, like, I had enough clarity to realize that doctors kind of did something different at that point, but I wasn't really sure what scientists did.
When you went to college, how did you decide to major in science? Or I'm assuming biology was your major?
Yeah, so when I went to college, I had so something happened in high school, which was that I participated in the science fair. And I was trying, even from high school, I was wrestling with how to link my social interest with the science, not understanding what science was about. But I was aware, because of these generational changes that had happened in Puerto Rico that I explained earlier, that there were, for example, like my grandparents used a lot of medicinal plants, mostly because of lack of access to the healthcare system. So I don't want to romanticize the use of medicinal plants in the context of resource-limited settings. But the truth was that I felt there was the common denominator with all these stories is that I felt there was a knowledge there that wasn't being that communities that were not benefiting from science. I couldn't verbalize it this way back then, but it was a feeling, like communities that were not benefiting from science, and also knowledge that wasn't being taken advantage of by science. And it was in the context of the use of medicinal plants. I became interested in the use of the plantain stem. So I knew of situations in which people will take the sap of the plantain stem and use it to treat patients of tuberculosis. So, yeah, so I conducted a study in high school in collaboration with a microbiologist that helped us with the TB, bacillus, and everything to test that, to empirically test, is this really killing the bacillus? And it turns out that it does, that it limits the growth. We still don't know why. I actually never follow up on that project. It could be for a trivial reason having to do with the acidity of the sap that will not actually work in physiological settings, who knows? But the truth is that at that moment, I was like, wow, this is really, it was a positive result. It linked all my interest. It was like really cool. So we presented it in the science fair with this other friend of mine, and it won the international science fair.
Wow.
Eventually we went to Argentina to represent the project after the ISEF, which was that year in Alabama. And that was my senior year in high school. So then I go to college, and the college that I had applied to all the colleges that all my peers were applying to. I'm in this kind of prestigious school in Puerto Rico called San Ignacio. It's a Jesuit school, one of the best schools there. And I am applying to like all the places that you will imagine, like Princeton, Harvard, all those places. So I get accepted into Harvard, and I go to Harvard. I had an idea of what Harvard was, but but vague, not to the extent of what people here in this seminar will think of Harvard today. And I go to Harvard, and I'm like, okay, so I'm gonna continue my plantain sap project. So I start meeting with faculty, presenting them this plantain sap project. And that was actually my first encounter with what I called my inherited identity as a minority in the US. And here I wanted to like kind of be nuanced about this and acknowledge that I consider myself a Hispanic. I'm very proud of being a Hispanic. But I don't want to compare to honor the struggles of Hispanic Americans that have been born in the US. I don't want to compare my experience growing up in Puerto Rico, which had its own challenges, but I don't want to compare it with one of a Puerto Rican growing up in the Bronx. They're two very different experiences. And the reason is that where I come from, I am the majority. So I come from a place where I grew up with, like, I have these sensitivities and the awareness of wanting to be an ally to people that are wrestling with minority issues like women, LGBTQ, like Black Lives Matter. Although I have it speaks to who I am, but I also want to acknowledge, not because I want to separate myself from it, but because I want to honor the very real difficulties that communities that grow up here being messaged continuously that they don't belong in certain spaces, how different that was from my experience. I come here, I mean, from a resource-low setting, but I come here to go to Harvard. I mean, I don't come here, like my parents are not, like, I wasn't going to a school where I was told like I couldn't go to Harvard. Like I was going to a school where I was told, of course, you should. You're bright. You should work and you should go to. So that messaging in my formative years was very important. But identities are complex. Mm-hmm. Identities are part of the identity is how you see yourself, but a lot of the identity is how others see you. And when I arrived at Harvard, it didn't matter how I saw myself. I saw myself as an immigrant. I mean, I can talk about, like, I'm not going to, but I'll just mention briefly, like, I mean, if you ask different Puerto Ricans, they'll have different perspectives of the Puerto Rico-US relationships, and that's gonna shape a lot of their identity. My perspective is that I grew up in a country that's militarily occupied by the US, and it's a colony. So
yes.
So essentially and it has been for 100 years. So and there are people that are gonna disagree with that viewpoint, but my point is, like, my experience coming onto the US was more similar to somebody immigrating from Europe or immigrating from Africa or immigrating from Asia. Like the immigrants that were coming into the US, the foreign students that were coming in were like that was kind of my experience. It's a different language, it's a different culture, it's a different place. I might as well have, from my perspective, I had a US passport, but from my perspective, I could have been in Germany. But at the same time, the way I was seen as a minority. And it took me 5 or 6 years to understand what that meant for me. But one of the early experiences, for example, when and it links to this story that I was telling about wanting to continue the plantain study. I remember going into this professor's office, and it's almost, I'll tell this story, it's like almost like it has its magic to it. You know, I'm at Harvard, I'm like from the Caribbean, like very different place. I'm walking into this gorgeous office that's covered floor to ceiling with shells of all sorts of sizes of like mollusks. It was gorgeous. And there's this like eminent professor in that desk there. And I started talking to him about my interest in linking, like, you know, understanding the use of medicinal plants and yada yada. He's supposed to advise me. This person is supposed to advise me about how to proceed with my career in biology at Harvard. And he looks at me and he says, look, I want to be very frank with you. I could care less about what you're interested in. I don't think it's interesting. I don't think it has, like, I just don't think it's practical. And he's telling me this while I'm looking at all these mollusk shells behind him. This guy studies how shells shapes change with evolution, which I think is a beautiful project. Okay, don't get me wrong. It's a beautiful project and very valuable to society and science. But in the context of what I was proposing to him, I'm like, what? And then, but this is really interesting part. And at the time I didn't understand that. It took me several years of thinking back on that memory to be like, oh, he told me I had an advisee, which was a Black woman. And she was also interested in these diseases that are not that common, that are really just affect Black people. I'm sorry, I don't care. Like, it doesn't affect most people. Like, it doesn't affect like normal people or something like that. And I was like, at the time, like now when I think back on that, that's, whoa, how offensive, right? This is 20 years ago. But at the time, what I was thinking is like, why is he talking about a Black woman? What does that have to do with me? Like, what? Like, I couldn't make the connection that it was years later that I was like, oh, this person, like we were, and it's something that I realized later. Minorities are not defined by what they are, but by what they're not. So the experiences of minorities in the sciences vary, well, in general, vary widely, because it's not a group that is homogeneous. So like all experiences vary widely, but even within the minority context, it's just it's like if you defined, it's like in neuroscience when you define like neurons and everything else. So everything else is a lot of different tissues, right? So anyway, so that was one of my my early experiences in college, and college, you know, it was a period of kind of big growth. Like I was talking about my experience in Puerto Rico being in this kind of like more, I mean, not that Harvard is not shelter, it's the ivory tower, but there were so many different people there from so many different parts of the world that I was really able to start seeing human experiences through other people's eyes. And I'll give an example. Like I had friends that took me to like an event that was, it was called, they probably still do it, but it's called Take Back the Night, which is an event where all these women go and it's dark and they start telling their stories of harassment and things like, and that was eye-opening. I went to an all boys school and I had no idea that was like how scary, like some of these contexts were. And that led to a reflection that I have shared in social media about the verb to be. Like, I feel like in our narratives of like being racist or being biased or being, they're like two states. They're like, you're either racist or you're not racist. And I feel that's too simplistic because like in Spanish, we have two verbs for the verb to be. One of them is to be, like you mean like to your essence, like I am Puerto Rican kind of thing. Or like in my case, because I identify as a heterosexual man, I am a man. But there is another verb that's also translates in English as be, but it means completely different. It's a different type of be, which means it's estar. And estar is a transient state. And I like to tell people that our biases we are not biased in the conjugation of the verb are, not in the stable state, but in the transient state. We have to recognize that because we all live with biases that we have to, or incomplete knowledge. And that is important to acknowledge, to give ourselves space to grow. And for me, like that period, and it has continued in my life, but that period was a big eye-opening period where I could see now perspectives from friends I had friends that were gay in high school, but they were not out for obvious reasons. I mean, I was in a traditional all-boys school. But then in college, when I started meeting friends that were out and had different experiences, then it just completely transformed who I am. And I became a better human being for it. And I've always sought those spaces where I can challenge my notions and my biases. And I think that's also part of being a scientist. Like, we have to do that as scientists. Like, if we were to use the same humility that we should be using in science to acknowledge what we don't know, to grow in knowledge towards these topics, I think we will be all better for it. And anyway, that was something, that's a reflection that I felt like I had in college. In terms of my own development back then, in the sciences, I'll share that from my first lab, like my very first lab experience. I'm talking about this like medicinal plants. I was a work study student, so I got a job in a lab, and I had this notion from my background. I had this notion of like, you just work your way up in the job. Like, you just come in at the lowest level and you just work your way up. So I come in and they're like, okay, you're gonna be washing dishes, and I'm like, perfect. Like, I can wash dishes. I'm just gonna work my way up. And I'm washing dishes. I'm not working my way up because I was hired to wash dishes. So I started doing a really crappy job, which I was, because I was bored out of my mind. And I got fired. And that was my very first lab experience. So my very first lab job was being fired shortly after. And frankly, I should have been fired. I wasn't doing a good job. But my experiences, like also training in science, were not incredibly positive in college. Like I was taking a lot of the pre-med classes because I was taking the science classes, and they were geared towards pre-med students because they were the majority. And I was pretty miserable taking those classes. But something happened when I started failing, which was very liberating. So I started getting C's and D's. And this is at Harvard, which is grade inflated. So I was really sucking in classes, okay? And this is like towards my sophomore year. And I was like, oh my God. But there came a point, and I've hit this point a few times in my life now, where I go from like panicking to like, I call it the fuck it state. Like, I was like, well, you know what, fuck it. And in college, what it meant was that I started meeting really interesting people in college that were genuinely interested in learning. They were not doing that great in school, but they were genuinely interested in learning. And I admired those people. And that's what I did. And it really helped me. I was just like, I'm not gonna study for the test. I'm just gonna try to learn. Mm-hmm. And as simple as that sounds, it was super liberating. And once I achieved that, not immediately, but within a year or two, I started doing much better. Like I just trying to find the joy of just learning and growing and not comparing myself. And I mean, it really came after a period of a lot of failures. So I just felt like I either was gonna drive myself crazy. I mean, it was like, at that time, Harvard was a pretty intense experience too. I don't know, there was a case of like a suicide murder that happened there when I was a freshman. So that was one of my first experiences. It was tragic, but there were people that were really on the edge. And I was looking at that and I was like, this is not worth it. Like, yeah. I didn't come here for this. And that same attitude, I used it later in grad school. So from there, just to get into grad school, because I know that otherwise we're gonna run out of time.
Why did you decide to go to grad school? If you had experiences in school.
Yeah. So before grad school, when I was
don't say like, fuck it, I'm gonna do a PhD and sign away 5 years of my life.
No, absolutely not. It didn't happen that way. What happened was that I had these experiences in the labs and in the classes, and I was like, I just need to get out of here. Like I had these opportunities to do summer research in the labs there, but I just felt like pressure cooker. It felt like people were just, and not all labs are like that. That's how it felt to me as an undergrad from the perspective that I had at that moment and with the labs that I was talking to. Not all places are like that. But to me, it felt that way. And I felt like I was still wrestling with trying to combine my interest in my identity. Like I didn't see any professors that looked like me. Like even grad students, and I was trying to combine all these interests. And I met one Peruvian professor, Ricardo Godoy, who was doing ecological studies in the middle of the jungle in Honduras. And I was like, that's pretty far away from Harvard, so let me go there. So and this place was like, you had to fly you go to Honduras, then you had to like take a bus out to a remote town, and then there charter an airplane that took you over the jungle. It was out of a movie, where the airplane had to fly over a flat field of cows so that they would move out of the way, then come back up, and then come back down before the cows came back. Okay, so it was like, you had to time it right. And then after that, you will like hire somebody to go in a canoe the river was too shallow to use an engine. So, and with a stick for 8 hours of river, then you will arrive at the research site, which was right next to this town of Native American indigenous groups from there, the Tawakas. And I lived there for 3 months, kind of doing census of the plants. And in that, there I realized 2 things. Like I did my thesis, which it's a whole other topic, but I did my thesis on their use of medicinal plants, kind of inspired by my high school experience on the use of the plantain sap. I realized 2 things. I realized these people will never have the opportunities that I have. I met brilliant people there that were and I don't want to romanticize but there were people that are as capable as you and I, but will never have the opportunities. And they're kind of stuck there. And I realized like, I'm coming here to kind of like learn from their knowledge, but I'm not bringing them anything. Mm-hmm. So I thought I need to go and prepare my mind if I want to impact these communities. Like just coming here and pretending that I am in the same level as them is not fair to them, and it's not true. Like they are as capable as I am, that's true, but they don't have the opportunities that I have. So when I am forfeiting my ability to take advantage of those opportunities, I'm forfeiting them for myself and for them. So that I had that mentality, and that kind of like clicked. And so the other thing is I was collecting plants, I was interviewing people, I was like doing all this work, which was beautiful, but my mind kept on going to the molecules. I kept on looking at those plants, like I would have them all hanging in this like shell of a house that I had rented from one of the indigenous groups there. And they were all hanging from the roof, and I would sit there at night kind of taking notes on the notebooks and looking at them and be like, what do they have inside? That's where my mind went. I didn't go to like, oh, let's find out what the other shaman in the next village is doing. I didn't care as much about that as I cared about what the molecules were. And doing that kind of analysis, I realized I need to go and prepare to answer those questions. And I'm not gonna be able to do it here because they cannot teach me that. What they're teaching me a lot, but I am not teaching them anything. This is not a collaboration. Like I'm actually just felt like I was taking their knowledge, which I was. I didn't do it that blatantly, but in a way I was. So, and it also made me realize the value of academic structures where you can really accelerate your knowledge gaining in a short period of time. And that kind of convinced me where I should go. I need to place myself in spaces where I can gather this knowledge in what I'm interested in, which is molecules, faster. But I still didn't see myself represented in academia, so I decided to, I looked for faculty that looked like me, and I found this professor at Duke University at the time. He's now at UT Galveston, Mariano Garcia Blanco. And I wrote him, and I interviewed with him, and I asked him for an opportunity to work in his lab. And he offered, I remember pouring my heart out in a conversation because he was also Puerto Rican, and this speaks to the differences of experiences and what people need at different career stages. Like I'm telling him all this like identity thing and science. He's listening to me. He was very kind. He was listening to me, and he said, you know, I've never felt that way. But I'll tell you what, why don't you come to my lab and work and see, you know, this is very personal. This is very individualistic. Like, why don't you come and work in my lab and see if this is for you? And I worked in his lab, and he had this crazy idea. He had listened to a talk by this guy here at Yale, actually, Joel Rosenbaum, on this algae called Chlamydomonas ringharti, who has a very polarized cell structure. It has 2 flagella on one side, the nucleus, and a chloroplast on the other. And Mariano wanted to know if the nucleus had architecture, like nuclear architecture that changed based on transcriptional programs in different parts of the cytosol. And no one in his lab wanted to do that project because that's not what the lab worked on. The lab worked on RNA editing and transcription and splicing. So he gave me that project, and it was wonderful. That's what convinced me that I wanted to go to grad school. I worked on it independently. and pretty independently. And they, and it just, I remember going to New York to Rob Singer's lab to develop fish in clammy. And kind of like, I was so into the project, like I was sleeping, like probably Rob doesn't even know this, but I will, like he left his office open and it was the only carpeted place. And I lived with a friend in Manhattan. So it would take forever to go from Albert Einstein to Manhattan. So some nights I'll just stay in his office. But it was because I wanted to. It wasn't because somebody was asking me to do it. And I was really into it. I loved it. I love the liberty of doing it. I think a lot of the skills that I learned trying to like interview indigenous groups, going to their villages, asking them for permission are skills that I use today to set up collaborations, to understand what people's concerns are, to see what I can bring into the collaboration. And that's what led me to go to grad school and join the lab of Sally Kornbluth. And then I think to round it up, so we can get to the Q&A. Let me see what
We can keep going. We should, please, by no means.
Okay. I can. Okay. So I went to Mariano's lab. That I went as a postbac. When I have continued to hire postbacs throughout my career because I feel it's so empowering. Like people call it taking time off, and I'm like, taking time off from what? Like it's just a continuation of your trajectory. And so I went to his lab, and one thing that happened in Mariano's lab is he was invited to teach a workshop at the University of Puerto Rico. And that was the first time that I really saw my identities kind of come together, like for real. But because I felt that I could bring something valuable back to my community. Like I went there and I taught this workshop with him and it was wonderful. And I was like, wow, people care about what I know and what I have learned. And that convinced me, okay, this is what I want to do. Like if I can do this, because science up to that point felt like something that I really wanted to do, but it felt selfish. It felt like selfish. It felt like Rome was burning and I was there like playing the fiddle, like la la la, you know, like it just felt like that in the context of my reality as a Puerto Rican and the community that I come from. Like when I saw people suffering in Puerto Rico, whenever I went back, or people asked me like, when are you coming back to help, or what are you gonna do with all that knowledge that you gain at Harvard? You're one of the few people from here that was able to go. What are you bringing? Like, what are you contributing to this place? Like it just felt like I checked out. Like I was like, okay, good luck to you guys. I'm gonna do something that just like strikes my fancy here in this kind of ivory tower, and that didn't sit right with me. Like I'm not saying I'm not saying actually, let me be clear, I'm not saying that's how science is. That's how science felt to me. Yeah. And Mariano doesn't feel that way. A lot of other Puerto Ricans don't feel that way, or minorities don't necessarily feel that way. More power to them. There are many ways of contributing to the world and science, but that's how it felt to me. So when I was able to do something that impacted people in Puerto Rico, I was like, okay, I can do this. I might not be saving lives, but I can teach, I can inspire students, I can do other things. And so then I went to grad school. I joined the lab of Sally Kornbluth. And while I was in Sally's lab, it was a wonderful experience. Sally is now the provost at Duke University. She was a terrific mentor. And while I was in her lab, there was an incident happened in Puerto Rico, which is that the US Navy had been using this island called Vieques as a military target site for 60 years. So this place had been bombed for 60 years continuously. I mean, no other place in planet Earth had been bombed for 60 years continuously. And it has a civilian population that had the highest incidence of cancer in the Caribbean. And so it was economically depressed. And so around that time, a pilot mistakenly killed a civilian. Like it dropped like a 500-pound bomb on top of a observation tower, and there was a guy smoking outside and died. And the people of Vieques started protesting. Like they all came together and they're like, no, this is enough. Like we're bombed every year. Our land is contaminated. We don't have jobs. We don't have hospitals. Like the women of Vieques cannot give birth in Vieques because they're trying to curtail the population growth. They send them back to Puerto Rico, hoping they just move away.
There still isn't a hospital, right?
There still isn't a hospital. All of these problems haven't been solved. So they started protesting the military bombings, and they protested it for several years while I was in grad school. But what happened in my second or third year in grad school, I was starting to study for my qualifying exams. And I went to Puerto Rico for a wedding. One of my cousins was getting married, and the Navy decided to do a vote with the people of Vieques to see if they wanted the Navy to stay or not. And right before the vote, they went out and gave everybody like $5,000 or something like that. Like this is like the day before the vote. So everyone was like, oh my God, you're buying people. Of course they were. But still 70% of the people voted that they wanted the bombings to stop. And the next day, the Navy had the harshest military bombing exercises that they have had in the previous 10 years. And that just bothered me to the core. Like I just couldn't come back. I just couldn't come back to grad school and just continue doing like my Westerns or whatever. So I had a conversation with some of the faculty, including Mariano, who was in my committee meeting. And I told them, look, I had made up my mind that I wanted to do civil disobedience. I guess for me it was a moment where I had to link my identity, who I was, with the science. And if I couldn't link them, I couldn't do the science.
Yeah.
So I went to him and I said, and to my mentor, Sally Kornbluth, and my other committee members, and I met them one by one and I explained to them what was happening in Puerto Rico. And I said, I have to do this. I have to go and protest. I'm going to do civil disobedience. It's going to be non-violent. But I'll likely get arrested because I'm going to be trespassing into the military base. And they were supportive, but they were clear too, which I appreciated. And they told me, look, usually when people do what you're doing, they don't continue in science. You have to kind of make a decision if you're going to be a scientist, if you're going to do this other thing. And I listened to them and I appreciated that clarity of thought, but I was also clear that I wanted to be a scientist. And I was clear that I needed to do this. So I just asked them, like, are you going to kick me out of grad school? And they were like, no, we're not going to kick you out of grad school. Are you going to fail me in the qualifying exam because of this, not because of my knowledge? And they're like, no, we're not. I was like, okay. So I'm going to take my papers. I'm going to mail them to the federal prison. And I'm going to go and do civil disobedience. And that's what I did. I actually did civil disobedience, was arrested, I didn't spend as much time as I thought in the federal prison. I only spent like 5 days. And I did the outline for my qualifying exam actually in federal prison. I tell people it's a great place to focus if you're studying.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll do that before my qualifying.
That's right, and I don't recommend it. But that was my Vieques experience. But when I left there, I thought, this is certainly one way of linking identity with who I am as a scientist, but it's not sustainable. You cannot do this, which is what they were telling me. And then I started thinking about building community, which is what later led to the building of Ciencia PR. I came back and I talked to Mariano again, and I told him I want to build this kind of community of scientists to really really think about how we can benefit Puerto Rico with our scientific knowledge through seminars, through writing articles in a newspaper. And that will take another hour to explain that project, but just very briefly, like essentially I told him, and he told me something also very important, very powerful, which was like, you finish your PhD, and then I'll help you build this. And he just kind of wanted me to focus on the PhD, which I did. And I finished my PhD. I published a bunch of papers. And then as soon as I finished my PhD, I went back to him and I said, okay, a promise is a promise. And we built this together, this Ciencia PR organization, which became, at the time, just very briefly, it's still going on. It's you actually volunteer into it, so you know it very well. But it's a site in which people can go and register. And if you're interested very broadly in science in Puerto Rico, it's really a bilingual site for community building. And when I set it up, the way that happened was I was at Stanford in Kongchen's lab for my postdoc. And I had met this undergrad that had set up a database for freezing worm strains. Mm-hmm. I saw that and I said, wait, this is perfect. This database is perfect for what I want to do, because you can change the strain name for the scientist's name and where it's in the freezer for where the scientist is and what the strain does to what the interest of the scientist is. So I convinced this undergrad to help me do it. And I was so bad at programming that the undergrad said, I'll do it myself. So he programmed the page. We put it online. I thought 20 or 25 people were going to register, which I thought would have been terrific because I didn't know 20 or 25 people interested in science in Puerto Rico at the time. But today has over 14,000 members, and it's a full-fledged organization that has led a lot of creation of a lot of projects, including helping spearhead the COVID response in Puerto Rico recently. So that I have been very proud of that. And in, you know, there's so many things I can talk about. I talked mostly about this social aspect, but I will say in this context, so we can get to the questions, I will say my experiences in grad school were mostly positive. I think at times I felt lost, like all grad students do. I had a group of friends that helped me kind of go through it. I think grad school, it was that when my identity as a Hispanic really clicked, because I was frequently reminded in the context of the grad school. I was also in the South, in North Carolina doing grad school, the spaces that I was meant to occupy in the US society, and that I wasn't really, not by people in the grad school per se, but necessarily, but by the society in general. I was frequently, like a policeman that will stop me or whatever, like I was frequently reminded that I just didn't belong at Duke, or I wasn't meant to belong at Duke.
Yeah.
But also, that's one narrative, but all narratives are incomplete. And the other narrative is I had all these mentors that were helping me and believed in me. And I chose to focus. I have a hard time talking about those narratives of prejudice, because I chose, in part because I had a privileged experience. Okay, I came here, as I was telling you, like I grew up in Puerto Rico, I came here to go to Harvard. But in part also because I feel like I also want to honor all the people that did believe that I could do it and were willing to spend time. And those narratives are also important. But there were tons of failures there. When I started my lab, I put this in my unofficial biography, like my trajectory was pretty linear, grad school, postdoc, lab. When I started my lab, it was really tough. Like I submitted over 50 grants. Most of them got rejected. I think now rejection is, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's just part of what my life is.
Yeah.
It's so much part of what my life is that I tell students, like, it was hard for me to grasp this when I was a student, but I don't know a single successful scientist that has not been rejected more than being successful. And I've been in the rooms where it has happened. I've seen Nobel laureate grants be rejected. I've seen papers from brilliant people be rejected. I've seen, like, rejection is just part of what we do. And it's part of the system, and sometimes it makes the work better, sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it makes the work better, and as such, it has its place. But it doesn't necessarily, it's not a rejection of you, it's a rejection of something, and that's important to acknowledge it. But it's a transition period to integrate that into your life.
We have a question, anonymous question. They're saying, thank you for your wonderful story. Do you feel that the creation of Ciencia Puerto Rico fulfilled your desire to help and maintain your identity as a scientist? What inspired you to continue postdoc studies and faculty after that?
My creation of Ciencia Puerto Rico allowed me to create, this is what happened, like, and I didn't mean it. I didn't have the foresight to think about it this way at the time. But what happened was that there are communities out there, the same way that we're having these, but this is kind of like fixed in time and space, except unless you guys when you put it online, then maybe other people will see it, but only the people that are signing up right now can see this. But there is a community of people interested in these topics, right? And that I will define as a community because of the interest. Now, there are communities of biochemists, and there are communities, and there's societies, and there are communities of like NYU, and there are clubs, and all of these identities are real, but there's some communities that are geographically dispersed. And our communities of origin, for those of us that are not from the main towns near the academic centers, and at that, from the families that are part of those, like for most of us, we have part of our community that is geographically dispersed, but that doesn't make it any less real. Yeah. So in my case, what happened with Ciencia PR is it enabled that community to coalesce in a space that was virtual, but very real. Like that community, once it came together, it wrote a book that was used by students in classrooms. Through using the online networks, we just essentially put out a request to scientists. Tell your story, tell what you're interested in science and why that has to do with Puerto Rico. Help translate what you do to a Puerto Rican kid, to yourself when you were a kid, of why And they were beautiful essays. There was an essay by a geologist that wrote about how the southwest of Puerto Rico was actually born in the Pacific. And the way they know that is because the southwest of Puerto Rico, which is an area that's very popular among Puerto Ricans for internal tourism, it's called Cabo Rojo. That means, in Spanish, it means Red Cape. And it's called Red Cape because it has this sedimentous reddish color. And it has that sedimentous reddish color because those are the fossilized exoskeletons of microorganisms that are reddish. And those microorganisms have never existed in the Atlantic. They only exist in the Pacific. So then teachers started using those essays to explain concepts like Pangea. And so all that came through this network. So this community had a common experience of growing without those examples when they were kids, kind of like the experience that I shared. And then they were willing to step up and do something about it. So that was, so it helped me find another home, no different than like Yale as another home or neuroscience as another home. Like, I say identities are additive.
Yeah. I have a question for you. I think all three of us on this panel are pretty socially engaged. And you said earlier that your committee said, well, if you do this, this is not a typical thing that a scientist would do. But there are a lot of other careers where that kind of engagement is celebrated. And why do you think that, what are the barriers that scientists face? And do you think that's changed over the years? Like, I don't know if this would have happened in this conversation and like us and who we are outside of the lab would have happened necessarily earlier on, or would it have? I don't know.
Right. So if I understand your question, let me answer it, but I don't know if I'm understanding it.
Yeah.
So not interrupt me. So scientists in training probably have a wide range of interest, and some of those interests might become careers. Because some interests might become careers, that doesn't mean that the other interests go away or your identity goes away. So let me first take the scientists that aspire to develop a career in academia. I recognize that the reason I was hired at Yale was not because of Ciencia PR. It was because of something that I haven't talked about today, but I haven't because I talk about it all the time, which is my other passion in life, which is my research. Like, I studied, like you mentioned, how synapses are formed, how they change. I do it in the context of the Nematal C. elegans. That was the reason why I was hired at Yale. That was the reason why I have been promoted at Yale. So I need to recognize, there's an important aspect in the context of the career to recognize in this context what you were hired for. If I had been hired to establish a lab that's a world-class lab looking at synaptogenesis, and I go back to my boss and I said, I didn't do that, but instead I picked up the piccolo and I'm playing it like a master now. They're gonna be like, that's wonderful for you, but this is not what you were hired to. You hire a plumber to fix your house, and that person is like, I just decided to paint the front porch, and your basement is flooded. You're not gonna be happy about it. So we have to recognize that first. Now, when you go to the training part, I tell students, and all of the students that are listening to this are probably going to be thinking about it from their own perspective. Let me generalize, because the perspectives are going to be different depending on your background and what you're thinking about today. But if your calling is academia, you need to understand what the levelers are in academia. We can talk about then your question in that context. Equally valuable, I have a lot of friends that do this, like some of the friends that are leading Ciencia PR do this. People are interested in education. People are interested in outreach. People are interested in policy, and they make a career out of that. And those requirements for those careers are going to be different from the ones in academia. And then you have people like me that I recognize my role in academia, but I also have this other interest, and those three things are not the same. Those three things. So if you're a grad student, I think an important thing to recognize is that you're in grad school. If you go to law school, you study law. If you go to medical school, you study medicine. If you go to grad school, you study how to become a scientist. Then what you do with that ability with that knowledge of how to be a science, you can take it anywhere you want. And there are many beautiful, valuable ways of doing it. But if you go to grad school and you don't learn how to be a scientist, then you're not using what grad school is for. That doesn't mean you're not going to bring your other identities to it, but you need to understand what you came to grad school to do in the first place. I think that's an important, that is my opinion. That is an important aspect of emphasis that we share.
We have another question from Nicole Felix. How did you overcome any struggles or, how did you overcome any struggles or imposter syndrome during your academic career?
I haven't. You tell me if you do it. I mean, I think that moment at Harvard when I wasn't really failing out, because Harvard, once they take you, they wouldn't kick you out, you know, but I wasn't doing well. I failed some classes. I just wasn't doing that great. It was like my sophomore year. I hit a point where I was like, okay, so who am I and what am I doing here? Like, what is my goal here? Is my goal here to get the grades? Of course, like I wanted to get the good grades, but why? Like I'm like going deeper. Why? And that brought me to a space that was more me about, I'm here to just learn and grow. Like, you know, when I got my job at Yale, that was my attitude too. Like, actually, there was something that Kong Shen, my advisor from postdoc, told me that was the most liberating thing that I needed to hear. I needed to hear this, and it was incredibly liberating when he shared it with me. He said, look, they're gonna give you resources to establish a great lab. Don't save them money. If you're gonna fail spectacularly. And that was so liberating, because I was like, I'm just gonna go, if I fail, I'm just gonna go into the sunset with works. People they're gonna be songs written about how spectacularly I failed. And it was liberating in the sense that failure wasn't my goal, but my point was that I started looking at it more. All of these things are opportunities. And I think that if we think of them too rigidly, like grad school is an opportunity to work for 5 years with somebody that is really passionate about something that you can learn from. All expenses paid, no concerns about not getting your paycheck, which most people in the world have, particularly right now. And that's what it is. And then you just kind of use it and try to grow as a person. And then the postdoc is another chunk of time like that. And like I was thinking, I was worried about tenure, but then I was thinking, you know, forget about tenure. I have eight or 9 years. After that, they might kick me out, but I have 8 or 9 years to just train some people and see what I can do. And then we'll see what happens. And I that was very liberating. So that helped me, but I still have imposter syndrome for sure. I think Camille froze there a little bit. Okay, you're back.
I'm back. We have 2 questions now. They're sort of related. So one is, how do these summer's events, call them BLM, COVID, Eco-Plunge, affect your thinking about the work that you plan to do? And is there genuine allyship that works between the effort that Ciencia Puerto Rico represents and efforts of the African-American community, realistically? And then the other question, which is related, is your community building effort for Puerto Ricans, and also with the rise of Black Lives Matter in recent years. While it's all very powerful, it feels somewhat limiting that these efforts are Puerto Ricans for Puerto Ricans, Blacks for Blacks, Asians for Asians. Is there a way or still unrealized vision for bringing people together across the ethnic divides to build a community that is actually welcome to all and not based on ethnicity or race? So somewhat similar questions for you.
So yeah, so I think I start with the second one. So I think the way that we open up these spaces in academic centers. So first we have to recognize that, let's talk about academia in particular. Academic centers, even if I were teletransported as a Puerto Rican with the knowledge that I have today and with all my titles 150 years ago, I wouldn't be able to work in the same institution that I'm working. Not because I can come with the same knowledge, which would be much better than the knowledge that people had 150 years ago at Yale. I wouldn't be allowed. Like it just, these places were not, women were not allowed, many minorities were not allowed. So we have to recognize that, and then we have to reflect about, well, how do those spaces, how do that historical reality and those legacy structures influence the situation right now? You know, like if you take a place like Yale, and this is not unique to Yale, you have the naming of Calhoun College. That didn't happen by chance. You have the fact that they had glass-stained windows with like slaves picking cotton. That didn't happen by chance. Like it wasn't somebody went to Walmart and needed something. Oh, that's the only one they have. This was designed by an artist to send a message to people. So how do those legacy structures affect us? And I think that in order to open up these spaces, the paradox of identity is that you have to recognize the specific identities, and then you have to recognize also the common humanity. So if you try to make something too broad and you dilute it, you're not recognizing who people are. They need platforms to be who they are, and identities are intersectional. I'm not even Puerto Ricans is not one thing. You know, there are many different, like the Puerto Ricans that were born in the Bronx and in Puerto Rico, that's one category. They're women, they're men, they're like, you know, transgender, different religions. Like it's many identities and those intersect. But what you do is you open up these spaces so that those people can bring their identity to those spaces. What I try to do in my lab is tell them, I want all of you in my lab. Because if I don't have all of you in my lab, then I'm missing part of you, and you're not gonna be the best scientist that you can be.
Yeah.
We have created, I mean, the situations that minorities face are similar, not because of who they are, but because of who they're not. But if we leave the conversation at that level, we're not gonna make minorities feel like they belong, because we're not gonna be getting to who they are. We're only gonna be discussing who they're not. So what a platform like Ciencia PR tries to do is like create a space where scientists, and we define it as an interest. We don't even define it as an identity. People interested in science in Puerto Rico can come in. It's really a bilingual platform where people exchange information. And we have created allyships with other groups, not only, African Americans, but look, we did it with Haitians after the earthquakes of Haiti to try to link the communities. We did it with Peruvian descendants and students that are trying to further the amount of Peruvian. And so we create I think the paradox here is that when you accept your identity and you accept an identity of other, it's more likely that that same practice is gonna lead to accepting all other identities. It's a little bit like, it's a good analogy. It reminds me a little bit of genetics. Like if you understand the DNA structure for a virus that uses DNA, you understand it for all living things. There's specificity, the DNA is not the same, but that understanding of identity has to come to a place of recognizing that while our humanity is common, the paradox is that we bring different experiences, and that richness of experiences is what makes science, I genuinely think makes science richer, because we bring it when we bring our interests, when we bring our spheres of influence of who science can influence. So that's what we try to do through the Ciencia PR.
That is a wonderful answer. Thank you. We have more questions are coming in. So someone has a question regarding the use of English as a main language for science. In many regions, including Latin America, learning and speaking English fluently is not granted for all the population, and university education is not done in English. How do you think we can better diffuse science and increase the visibility of work done in countries where science is not done and taught in English?
You know, I think language can be used to include or to exclude. And it's not the language, it's how people intend the use. So I've had conversations with colleagues that are like, I only speak English in my lab. And I respect that. And they're like, but I actually encourage people in my lab to speak whatever language they want to speak, as long as they include other people. And that might sound paradoxical. Like, how do you include other people if they don't speak the language? You include them by making them part of the conversation, by sharing why are you speaking your language? What is behind that? Like the reason that you're speaking your language in a professional context or a setting to another person that speaks your language is because you don't want anyone else to hear you, then that's a problem. But if you're doing it because you miss where you come from, because you want to create more connection, that's a way of including not only the person that you're talking to, but also including other people that you can share that experience with. Yeah. So I think it's more profound than just like this language or that language, and it's about what is the intent in the use of that language. Even in English, there are I've had Indian colleagues that have been told by European colleagues that they need to, that whose first language is not English, that they need to fix their accent. So English is the first language of the Indian person. So even concepts like accents, like which accent is valued, who has an accent, who doesn't have an accent. I like to use accents as proxies to explain identity. Like I gave a talk at the Gilliam's Fellows meeting, and I asked the audience, I asked them, please raise your hand if you don't have an accent. Most students raised their hand. And I kept on repeating the question until the students picked up that there was something off and started lowering their hands. When everyone had lowered their hands, I said, that's right. Everyone here has an accent. You might have an American accent, but you have an accent. Like people say, like, I don't have an accent because I speak like people in the news. Which news? BBC? Like Australian news, US news, everyone has an accent, but accents are valued differently. It's the same thing with identities. It's the same thing with languages. So I use Spanish when I want to relate science to Spanish speaking people. When I go to China to give a talk, I try to learn a few phrases in Chinese just to honor the same, like every place I've given a talk at, I try to say like a few welcoming phrases at the beginning. And then I say, I'm sorry, I don't know your language. I cannot say more. I'm going to give the rest of my talk in English. But it's about making people relate rather than like an absolute answer of a language. I see it that way.
I think this all speaks to the importance of culturally relevant science, these last few questions, because science is not apolitical, science is not acultural. And I think your experience and the experience of other people who are asking questions have shown that you can not only contribute by, posing questions that have to do with your upbringing, but also like what Ciencia Puerto Rico is doing with making textbooks that are culturally relevant, not just to Puerto Ricans, but maybe people around all of the Caribbean, which is very racially and culturally diverse. And those lessons that you learn along the way can also be applied to other situations. So any work that you do for your community, once we recognize the intersectionality of all of our identities, we can start applying those lessons. We have, I think the last question on this list is from a graduate student. They're saying, as a graduate student during these protests, I related a lot to your experience going home and seeing the protests about the bombings. In these life-changing events, how do you decide what aspects of your identity to prioritize in your next career step? I have always intended to stay in academia because it was the most interesting, meaningful thing to do, but now it's hard to justify that with the world issues going on. How do you keep motivated to continue in science when social justice issues seem more pressing?
I will say that your existence in academia is a statement, and we need to recognize that. I think in the current society, if your calling is science, do science. If your calling is education, do education. But that is like what I tell, like students, this links to this concept of plan B. Like students come to me and they're like, okay, so I want to develop a plan for my plan B. And I ask them, okay, so what's your plan A? Because if you have a plan B, you need to have a plan A, right? So if what you're calling plan B is your plan A, but you don't want to verbalize it because you're worried about what your advisor will say, it's very different from your plan A being academia and you being afraid to verbalize that because you don't know if you can make it. Those are two very different scenarios and they need to be discussed differently. So let me start with the one that your plan A is academia. If your plan A is academia, remember that your existence is an act of resistance in this current setting. If you're a minority, or if you're sensitive to these things, which if you're in this audience and listening to this talk, you are, if you are going to be an ally, if you understand them, if you're getting educated on this and your calling is academia, go for it. And know that just doing that is in and of itself a revolutionary act. And you can do it right now because people literally died so that you could occupy these spaces. And we are links in a historical progression, and you're gonna be part of that. And there are gonna be opportunities as you follow your passion. There are gonna be opportunities. This is a marathon. It's not a 100-yard race. Now, if your passion is policy, that's a separate conversation. Then go and do that. But don't feel that you have to go and do policy because right now you don't have clarity of vision about how you and as an academic scientist are going to be able to further policy. And I'll give you a very concrete example. Like I'm I work on C. elegans in neuroscience at Yale in New Haven, and where I am right now. And I was part, and this gets to another question that I saw on the chat, I was part of a movement in Puerto Rico that transformed the testing capacity in Puerto Rico. And I haven't done a single test of COVID. I am not a virologist, but the knowledge that I have as a scientist of where I see a problem, I find a solution. The knowledge that I've developed throughout the years of collaborations, the alliances that I've established through these networks of Ciencia PR and other things, enabled me and a group of scientists that are part of this community during the pandemic of the century to get together and mount a response that literally, like I'm convinced today, it saves lives. Did I set up Ciencia PR for that? Did I become a Yale professor for it? No, like that's impossible to foresee. You just kind of, my experience has been, and like that I can give you a few examples, but my experience has been, what you do it with passion, do it well, follow your calling. And you know, I'm aware that when I occupy podiums, like when I'm invited to give a talk at different academic centers or around the world, I can see students that look at me standing in that podium the way that I looked at other people standing in other podiums when I was a student, and they feel represented in those podiums. So, and I think that's powerful. And it's not about me. It's not like it's about you recognizing that that could be your role if academia is your calling. But don't go to academia because you feel that you have to occupy those spaces, and don't leave academia because you feel that you have to policy, because then you're going to end up in the wrong track and you're not going to be true to who you are. Follow your passion. And also don't, like, for people with imposter syndrome, my advice is don't become your worst critic. Don't reject yourself before other people reject you. You're gonna be rejected. I've been rejected many times. But I try not to reject myself before other people reject me. Because if I reject myself before other people reject me, by not giving me the opportunity of achieving something, I take away the opportunity of failure and of growth. Mm-hmm. And that is a bigger loss than being rejected. It's like when people feel embarrassed, and maybe with this I'll close the loop. Like when I was talking about the questions, like my parents, one of the great things that they did for me was making me feel comfortable asking all these questions, even if they were annoying to other people. In settings in which I have felt it vulnerable in a way that I don't feel comfortable asking questions, I grow less. And I deprive myself from the opportunity of growth. And that's the worst. I think that's worse than asking a stupid question by far. Like I much rather, although I don't feel it necessarily all the time, but when I think about it rationally, I much rather people be like, wow, that was dumb, than depriving myself the opportunity of learning and growing for pretending to know something that I don't know, or pretending not to sound dumb. It's the same thing about the other aspect of being rejected and following your passion.
Okay, so I think with this we have to wrap up. We're running a little over time. Luigi?
Yeah, thank you so much, Danielle. This was very insightful, very inspiring. I think I would have lost to listen to you for another few hours. This was already wonderful. Thank you so much, Camille, for moderating. Thanks everybody for attending. The recording will be posted on the Growing Up in Science website and on the Growing Up in Science YouTube channel. We will hope you will join us for future events as well. The upcoming event in September is going to be about establishing systems to hold PIs accountable for the quality of their mentorship. And in the meantime, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.